Hi, Mystery Recapped here. Today, I'm going to explain a sci-fi thriller movie called The 13th Floor. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. The movie begins in a room in the Wilshire Grand Hotel in Los Angeles. It is 1937, and Hannon Fuller, a billionaire businessman, composes a letter for one of his employees. In it, he confesses that he has made a dangerous discovery that'll most likely get him assassinated. He then enters the hotel's ballroom and gives the letter to a bartender, Ashton. The old man explains that a guy named Douglas Hall will come looking for the letter, but as Fuller takes a cab home, the bartender unseals the letter and reads its contents. Meanwhile, the billionaire reaches home and heads straight to bed. Just as he lays down with his wife, he suddenly wakes up in a laboratory in 1999 Los Angeles. It is revealed that the 1937 version of the city, as well as the people living in it, are simply a virtual simulation. They are artificially programmed by Fuller's multi-billion-dollar company, which has developed a cutting-edge virtual reality simulator. Fuller then goes to a nearby bar where he orders a martini. Shortly afterward, he excuses himself and goes to a payphone, which is kept in one corner of the bar. He then leaves a message for Douglas on the answering machine, but his call is interrupted by a mysterious figure whose face is concealed behind the bar's back door. Nonetheless, Fuller readily goes with the strange man, and it seems that he trusts him. The scene then shifts to a dark alley where Fuller is about to reveal his discovery to the mystery man, but before he can do so, the stranger whips out a knife and stabs him, killing him on the spot. The following morning, Fuller's protege and computer engineer Douglas Hall wakes up in his apartment. He switches on his answering machine and simultaneously goes to the washroom. To his horror, he finds a bloodied shirt dumped in his trash can. A recorded message from Detective McBain of LAPD then urges him to visit Fuller's office. In the next scene, Douglas enters the office, where he identifies the billionaire's dead body. After that, the detective questions him about what project the company was involved with, but Douglas says it is classified information that he doesn't want to reveal. The two then walk to Fuller's office, where they meet a woman named Jane. She introduces herself as the billionaire's estranged daughter. This surprises Douglas, as Fuller had never mentioned about having a daughter. While the detective takes her aside for questioning, Douglas visits the 13th floor of the building. There, one of the programmers, Whitney, is grieving the loss of their boss. It is revealed that the company is currently working on building a VR simulation of 1937 Los Angeles. Whitney says that Fuller had been repeatedly entering their simulation, though they were months away from the first trial. Suspicious about the chain of events, Douglas asks his fellow employee if he knew that their boss had a daughter named Jane, but Whitney responds that he had no idea about it. Douglas then goes to the window and watches Jane leaving in a cab. He is sure there is something fishy with the woman and decides to pursue her without letting anyone know. That's just stalking. In the meantime, Detective McBain meets Whitney and questions him about the nature of their research. The latter reveals that their virtual reality is filled with simulated humans who are unaware that they are computer programs. The reason they chose to simulate 1937 LA was because Fuller wanted to relive his younger days. Meanwhile, Douglas manages to find Jane at a nearby hotel and stops her in the lobby. He then asks her about her last conversation with Fuller. She reveals that her father asked her to come to the US from France and help him with the shutdown of the new VR system. This once again surprises Douglas, as the billionaire had never mentioned wanting to stop their project. In the next scene, Jane meets with her lawyer to discuss the company's future. To her surprise, she reveals that Fuller has made a last-minute change to his will and named Douglas Hall as his heir to the company. On the other hand, Douglas also gets this news through McBain and is equally puzzled. The detective warns him not to leave town, as he is now a suspect in this case. That night, Douglas finds a message from Fuller on his answering machine that he had missed earlier. In it, the billionaire reveals that he has left a message for him in the 1937 Los Angeles simulation. This intrigues Douglas, so he goes back to the office and plans to enter the virtual reality world. Whitney is against the idea, but after a lot of insistence, he reluctantly agrees and sets the timer for 120 minutes. Douglas then lays down in a chamber and soon enters the consciousness of a bank clerk named John Ferguson. You'd think he'd have picked something less fantastically pathetic. Shocked by the sudden change, he goes to the restroom to find his bearings. He then recalls Whitney's information that Fuller used to teleport into the consciousness of an antique shop owner named Grierson, who lives in Pasadena. That somehow sounds even worse. Thus, he heads outside, grabs a cab, and heads to the spot. Upon reaching it, Douglas comes across the owner of the shop, who looks just like Fuller. Although the old man feels like he has seen Douglas before, he doesn't exactly recognize him. After all, this shop owner is a simulation created using the VR technology. Next, Douglas travels to the Wilshire Grand Hotel, as per the information given by Whitney. There, he comes across Ashton, a simulated bartender. Douglas asks him if Fuller had left any message or letter for him, but Ashton, who had actually read the letter, says he has no idea about it. In the meantime, Douglas's time in the virtual reality starts to run out, so he rushes to the restroom where his simulated body has a seizure, and he wakes up back in his office. That evening, Douglas meets up with Jane in a hotel ballroom. He reveals that the billionaire had tried to contact him right before his death, but no matter how hard he tries, Douglas cannot remember if he talked to Fuller on that fateful day. He is beginning to suspect that he might have killed the old man, and somehow the memory got erased from his brain. In response, Jane suggests he tell the police about this and distance himself from the VR machine. After this conversation, the two dance on the ballroom floor and eventually share a kiss. Later that night, Douglas is arrested in his apartment as the primary suspect in the murder of Hannon Fuller. Detective McBain reveals that his car was seen in the security footage of the bar where the crime happened. The detective thinks that because Fuller wanted to shut down the company, Douglas killed him as he was intent on making more money. He is then taken to prison while the police investigate the case further. But shortly afterwards, Jane arrives at the police station and bails him out. Douglas tells her that he will find out who killed Fuller by logging into the VR system again. Following this, he goes to the office, sets the timer for 120 minutes, and slips into a chamber. He is soon transported into the body of John Ferguson in the virtual reality version of 1937 Los Angeles. Douglas then returns to Grierson, the antique shop owner modeled after Fuller. The two men chat, and Grierson mentions that he recently found something strange under his bed. It was a monster. He then takes out a fancy briefcase, which has a luxurious suit in it. He never bought that suit, nor does he remember wearing it, but it fits him perfectly. Upon witnessing this, it quickly dawns on Douglas that the suit was kept there by Fuller. When the billionaire used to transport inside Grierson's body in this simulation, he would wear this suit and visit the Grand Wilshire Grand Hotel. Following this, the two go to the hotel, where the staff greets Grierson as Fuller. They sit down in one corner of the ballroom, and Grierson begins to concentrate hard. He tries to look into his brain for memories from times when Fuller took over his consciousness. After a while, he finally remembers giving a letter to Ashton, the bartender. Douglas then follows Ashton, who seems to have snuck out to the locker room after noticing the two men talking intensely. As soon as Douglas reaches there, he jumps him from behind. The shady bartender then holds him at gunpoint and begins to spill everything he knows. He admits to reading the message and discovering that he is an artificial creation. Furthermore, he mentions that he drove to Tucson and followed the exact instructions in Fuller's letter. What he found out shook his entire world. He saw the edge of his world, a green net frame of electronic code. It was then that Ashton realized he lives in a computer-generated reality. The revelation drove him insane, and he started trying to figure out where Amaranth lives. Now, he wants to punish Douglas for making him go through this strange realization. But before he can cause any damage, Whitney yanks Douglas out of the simulation. In the aftermath of this incident, Douglas understands that the characters in the simulation have real lives and feel real emotions. By creating this VR and hopping in and out of the simulation, they're simply messing with their lives. Thus, Douglas decides to shut down the project forever. Following this, he drives over to Jane's hotel, but finds Detective McBain waiting in the lobby. He tells Douglas that Jane has been missing for quite some time now. He claims that according to his research, Fuller doesn't have a daughter, and that there's no woman named Jane Fuller in the US or France. chance. That seems unlikely. Later, Douglas finds the cab driver who took Jane to the hotel a few days ago. He pays the driver to divulge information about her whereabouts. Turns out she used the same cab to go to a nearby neighborhood. So he tracks her down and shockingly discovers that her real name is Natasha Molinaro, and she works as a grocery store clerk. Douglas then goes to the store, but Molinaro does not recognize him clearly. She says she has a vague sense of deja vu and feels like she has seen him somewhere. Douglas, who is beginning to fall in love with Jane, now realizes that she doesn't exist in his reality. Jane is simply someone who teleports into the body of Molinaro, just like he teleports into the body of John Ferguson. This raises a question in his mind. Is the world that he lives in a reality, or simply another generated simulation? And if it's the latter that's true, can he plow animals and get away with it? To get his answers, Douglas gets in his car and takes the exact route that Ashton had taken on suggestion of Fuller's letter. After driving for several hours, he discovers a point beyond which his world becomes a crude wireframe model. Douglas now fully understands Fuller's message. 1999 Los Angeles, the one he is living in right now, is nothing but a virtual reality. This means that he, too, is an artificially created simulation. In the meantime, Jane re-enters the simulation by teleporting into the body of Molinaro. She then calls Douglas and asks him to come to Fuller's office, promising to explain everything. After they meet, Jane finally reveals the truth. His world is one of thousands of virtual worlds, but it is the only one in which one of the occupants has developed a virtual world of their own. Jane further reveals that she lives in the real world, outside the 1990s simulated Los Angeles. After Fuller's death, she entered the virtual version to assume the guise of his daughter. She wanted to gain control of the company and shut down the simulated 1937 reality, but her plan was foiled when Douglas was made the company's heir. The virtual Douglas is modeled after Jane's real-world husband, David, but she admits to falling in love with Douglas, despite him being just a simulation. Jane further reveals that David was the one who murdered Fuller using Douglas's body. She claims that her husband was a decent man when they got married, but as time passed by, something happened to him, and he began to use the simulation as his own personal playground, where he started killing people for fun. After pouring her heart out, Jane takes Douglas to bed, and the duo gets it on like Sims. Later that night, a jealous David re-enters Douglas's body and attempts to choke Jane, but she manages to grab a nearby lamp and hits him on the head. She then manages to escape in an elevator and quickly reaches the ground floor. However, her luck runs out as the main door to the building is locked shut. Soon enough, David also arrives on the ground floor and makes his way towards her with malicious intent. Fortunately, before he can take action, Detective McBain arrives at the scene and shoots him dead. Jane asks what took him so long, since she knew David was going to plug in. It is then revealed that she planned her husband's death in Douglas's body so as to trap his consciousness in this simulation. This allows Douglas's artificial consciousness to take control of David's body in the real world. In the final scene, Douglas wakes in 2024 in David's bedroom, connected to a VR system. He disconnects the headgear and walks outside, where the real Jane is waiting for him. She then takes him outside, where he sees a futuristic Los Angeles and her father, the real Hanson